How is my girl Stephanie doing?
Which one?
Stephanie Davidson!
Oh, she's asleep right now, so she's fine.
Awesome. Awesome.
There's so many of them.
I know, it's like, which one are you
It's
talking about?
yeah.
There we go. Okay, perfect. All right, guys. Well, welcome to the Dave Rasco Show, episode 1. We made it. This is it. I don't want you to notice the shirt here. Do you know who this is?
Oh wow.
This is the evolution of man, hominid, Neanderthal, Tom Brady.
I need that.
Here's my first question for you. Uh, how in the world did the greatest of all time, like the most inspirational, motivational quarterback ever, number 3, Jameis Winston, lose? I think it was the kicker. I mean, we had 2 Nick Folk misses. The Bucks are my favorite team on earth.
I'm sorry.
I don't know if
That's
you watch
tough.
Hard Knocks.
I didn't see much of it. I saw like a couple of clips, but
Hard
you
Knocks
know
is
how did they lose? Well, I think that was a terrible football game. First of all, just like almost every other Thursday night football game is just bad football. It's just bad watching. I think they have less time to prepare than they would for a normal game. Um, and I don't know, for whatever reason, you just get crap games. And that was a terrible, terrible football game. I mean, Jameis Winston missed open receivers everywhere on the field. The Patriots committed like almost 15 penalties.
so
It doesn't get much uglier than that.
every year. Whoever is on Hard Knocks, that's like my favorite team. I think Hard Knocks, the show, is like maybe one of the best shows ever created. I love it. Like I freak
Really?
out. I freak out about it. I'm like
Huh.
Game of Thrones level with it. Although
Really?
although I actually cried a little bit whenever Jon and Daenerys got together. Like I was like standing up and screaming. I was so
Huh.
excited.
You get that excited for incest?
Like, I'm, I'm glad we could start out on this note. I think
Well, yeah.
that's how this is gonna go. Salty,
Yeah.
informal, and off track is what we're gonna do.
Nothing
Um,
spells loving like a sister and her cousin.
oh my gosh. Well, I guess we'll get kind of started. So, Pat and I have known each other for a while. We met, I guess, like close to a year and a half ago at Dr. Ben House's seminar in Austin, and then we've hung out at 3 of those seminars since. So, Pat's a PhD in exercise physiology. He's written multiple books, and probably one of my favorite things about you, Dr. Davidson, is like you really live it. You're actually in the trenches. There's a quote I really liked. My boy Justin Moore, amazing strength coach out of the Jersey, and he said, "I believe that
He
as
really is.
he's a beast." His article on the T Spine coming out, I got may or may not have got a sneak preview. Wow, like I mean, you want to talk about sacred cows? That guy nailed it. So. But he said, I believe as a strength coach, having a physical practice where you're constantly trying new things, failing, learning, and improving yourself is paramount to your success as a coach. Get your hands dirty, get in the trenches, and live it. Your athletes and clients will see it and appreciate that you walk the walk. And, I think that's something we've always had in common is like whatever we talk about, that's really what we do. Me more so, and I'm always kind of preaching about the lifestyle and the sleep and the nutrition and whatnot. That's sort of the world that I came from, and then I've learned so much over the last few years from you. But aside from being just a crazy meathead, I'm going to go ahead and start the mutual admiration party. One thing that really struck me about you was at the last Costa Rica retreat, we had a gratitude circle, and about half the people there were like, Dr. Pat Davidson not only is just this really smart dude, but he like changed my life. And so many people express very deep emotionally like how you took them under your wing, like at Springfield College or these other places, and really like just brought them to the place they want to be. And that's how I think of any coach. Like a good coach is not just someone who is going to teach you exercise. The definition is to bring you from where you are to where you want to go, right? And that's sort of what you embody. So I'm so grateful that you were willing to do this for me and kind of push me to get this podcast on. I actually had like a vision of like about 5 years ago. I was like, man, I really want to do a podcast one day. And I'm a little bit addicted to podcasts. Like I probably listen to about 5 a day. It's kind of like a problem. I just love them. So it's really cool to be able to get to do one with you. So.
Well, I mean, I appreciate you saying that, and that was definitely an interesting experience in Costa Rica because we found out that a lot of people seem to like me for some reason. We also found out that I've touched a lot of kids, and but I really think that like people oftentimes ask me like, what's my path? Like, what would you recommend me to do for, like, it's amazing to me that sometimes people ask me like, well, I want to be more like you. And I'm like, are you out of your mind? Like, but I guess I can kind of see where those questions would start to come from now, and it's like, it's hard to explain because I feel like my path has been so bizarre and circuitous and like lucky in a lot of ways. But I think that the reason that I can positively affect people and that people will tend to maybe gravitate towards me or get something out of me is that I do think that I'm brutally honest.
Right.
And I think that I got that actually by going through recovery for addiction to drugs and alcohol. And because you have to face truths about yourself that are not pretty. There's so many things that I've personally done in my life that I'm so ashamed of, and like you have to go back through your deeds, your thoughts, your actions, and really be able to pick up on the patterns of those things. And I've been able to do that, and at least like acknowledge those things, like both on paper and out loud in front of other people. And I remember how good I felt after going through that process. You talk about restoration and recovery. I still don't think anything can compete with actually like a true moral inventory and truly getting to know yourself psychologically, emotionally, and personally, and then being able to put it out there into the world. It's a complete game changer that nobody really talks about. If you're just blocking blue light with glasses, I really think you're scratching the surface. Because we're usually talking about a brain, and brains can get bogged down with so much stuff. But in particular, I think in America, modern America, like degrees of self-loathing, self-restraint, inability to truly be yourself with the inundation of what you're supposed to be, those things can just lock you up like nothing else. And until you kind of, at least for me, now this might not be for everybody.
It makes total sense. And even from, I think a lot about the sort of interplay between just the worlds that I've lived in, functional medicine and PRI. And I'm always trying to make analogies between those two. And then like one idea is, if someone's table tests aren't getting better, maybe have them like do a nice deep meditation for 10 minutes and watch the changes. And it's sort of so counterintuitive. It's like, well, you didn't do anything for a joint position. It's like, well, maybe that's not the limiting factor, right? Maybe that self-awareness piece, and like you've talked about with people not having the sensory experience, that's sort of what they're looking for in a lot of the fatigue-based models, is like they just want to feel something.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's I think that tests are very interesting. The table tests are they're at least some objective standard that we're looking to be able to demonstrate change in, and it's like they're indicative of a rabbit hole, because what is preventing you from getting into those joint positions? For some people, it might be simply just like they can't find and feel a certain muscle. For other people, it is like they are moving themselves into an autonomic realm that's driven either through the prefrontal cortex, like extremely cognitive components. These are people that are like cognitive anxiety warriors. They're people that are, at times where they shouldn't be, they're worried about terrorist threats, or they're worried about the stock market or whatever. And
Did you hear that the transgender are now allowed in bathrooms?
Yes, exactly. Essentially, you're type A people,
Yeah.
like your true clinically diagnosed assholes. Then you also have the people that are this limbic emotional brain that is, because we're always going to be talking about autonomics when it comes to these sorts of things. And there are multiple parts of the brain that project axons to the hypothalamus. And then the hypothalamus will project its axons to the brainstem. And the brainstem is where autonomics lives. So it's like just follow the money, so to speak. And the money points to the prefrontal cortex projecting to the hypothalamus, and then limbic structures, including things like the amygdala projecting to the hypothalamus. So if I can quiet some of those things, then I'm going to be affecting projections to the hypothalamus, and I'm going to be affecting projections from the hypothalamus to the brainstem. And then those brainstem regions will change the entire vegetative state of the organs of the body. Right. And if I change the vegetative state of the organs of the body, this is when we get into this polyvagal sort of vagus afferent feedback going up to the brain. And now it's like, this is like the depths and the weeds of the polyvagal theory in terms of neuroception and interoception. And in that neuroception is this concept of like, your emotions. Like, what the hell are those things? They're actually the analysis of the brain based on the feedback it's getting from the status of the gut as well as the status of the facial muscles. And then the output of that is going to be one that reduces heart rate, like depending upon if it's quality vagal input from the gut and the facial muscles to the brainstem. But if I get quality gut and quality facial muscle expression to the parts of the brain that are receiving that, then it's going to send out all the signals for improving heart rate variability. If I can do that, I'm going to completely change everything about the system from a variability standpoint. And ultimately, that's what we're believing we're measuring with those tests, is like the combined variability presentation of the organism, and everything about chronic stress is going to drop off variability.
Right.
So that's always kind of like what I'm thinking. Like, what is threatening you?
Right.
Is your cognitive pieces threatening you? Are your emotional pieces threatening you? Is your airway management threatening you? Is your inability to be able to get on your heels threatening you because you're now perceiving yourself as falling in a direction and you have to kick on reflexes to prevent yourself from falling?
And sort of that positive feedback loop of like the more threats that are introduced to the system, that sort of might upregulate that threat attunement bias as a whole.
100%. It's just neuroplasticity. If you can get really good at feeling threatened and creating that feedback loop.
I heard it once described as like, it's like with hypercortisolemia, or just always being in that stress response, like taking a machete through a forest and you clear this one path right down the central stress pathway. It's like you get to this big forest and you're like, well, there's a clearing, and you just pew, pew, pew.
Well, I think that specifically from because you always want to get to the most scientific answer, and unfortunately we kind of have to follow a reductionist thought process with that, is that you would follow the stress response and you would ask yourself, what is the stress response? And the answer would be that it's an elevated glucocorticoid status in the circulation. And then you would say, well, what are the effects of these glucocorticoids on the cells that they bind to in the brain? And the effects of glucocorticoids on things like the hippocampus, which would be based on memory formation, is that it downregulates the hippocampus and it causes atrophy of hippocampal cells and potentially cell death. And it does that to most of the brain regions that we like the cerebellum. And unfortunately, there is one brain region that thrives and upregulates its receptor activity and upregulates its learning capabilities and long-term potentiation in the presence of chronically high glucocorticoids. And unfortunately, that structure is the amygdala, which seems to have everything to do with fear and everything to do with aggression and everything to do with hyperreactivity. So it is a nasty little system of cyclical ascendance of a amygdala, which can throw everything out of whack. And again, the amygdala is part of the limbic system that projects to the hypothalamus, which then projects to the pituitary, which then projects all over the place, including the adrenal gland, which is where you pump glucocorticoids out from. So the amygdala, when it gets more powerful, has a way of improving its ability to feed itself more of what it likes to make itself grow more powerfully. Right. So it is, in fact, like a snowball or a positive feedback system. And it's one of the few positive feedback systems that exist in the body, because most systems are negative feedback systems.
And that's also passed down epigenetically, or like if you're in the womb and you're surrounded by your mother's stress hormones with no fault of your own, you'll sort of have a heightened amygdala. That's something I've been dealing with, an overly active amygdala for quite some time. So that's like, I think one of the reasons I'm so like primally driven towards a lot of the wellness type, activities to try and somehow sort of tone that down a little bit. So,
I think that a book that should be on everybody's reading list is Homeostasis, Allostasis, and the Cost of Physiological Adaptation. And I remember one of the quotes that's so simple and so powerful is that physiology drives behavior. And we use behavior to regulate physiology. So it's exactly what you're saying there, where, if you've got a physiological state that is crying out for help, oftentimes there is a behavior that you can execute that can move you in a positive direction away from what you're experiencing that could be like a deleterious situation. And, it's interesting. I'm from Irish heritage, and we're full of like colloquialisms and like cliche sayings. But there's the story of like the people that are trapped in the flood, and there's the guy that's stuck on his roof, and somebody comes along in a rowboat, and the guy says, "No, I'm not going to hop in there. I'm waiting for God to save me."
Oh yeah.
And then somebody comes along in like the helicopter, and he says, "No, I'm waiting for God to save me." And long story short, the guy dies up on the roof, and he gets to heaven, and he meets God, and he goes, "Hey, what's up with this fact that you didn't come save me on the roof during the flood?" And God was like, "Are you kidding me? I sent you a boat, I sent you a helicopter, and you turned down everything, you fool." Like, So it's the same thing. Like, some people are just waiting, and they never take action. And it's like, if you wanna do something, you gotta help yourself.
Yeah, I love it. Well, I guess we'll get to our first question. I almost called this the Rabbit Hole Podcast. I just thought, this is a kid-friendly neighborhood. I didn't want it to be misconstrued, the wrong way. But I'm pumped. So
I like
Tio, my boy Tio Ledesma, who is going to be at the Rethinking the Big Pattern seminar in Austin. This thing's lined up. We got Zach Couples, Lucy Hendricks, Dave Wilton, Paul Monet.
They're all coming?
It's going to be some heavy hitters.
Holy cow! I better bring my A game.
Yeah, we'll talk, and we're going to talk more about it for sure. So,
yeah.
Tio's question: what does Pat do to address lower back pain in clients for temporary fixes and long-term fixes?
Okay, so it's like, I usually have like my little cheat sheet in my head that I kind of go with. Like, if I hear shoulder, I usually think they need abs so that they can actually get air into parts of their lungs that maybe they're not getting air into. And that'll push a rib cage into a scapula, and a scapula will push back onto a rib cage. And once that happens, the muscles lock in, and we all of a sudden start seeing shoulders not hurt as bad. When I hear knee pain, I always think like, oh, this person's probably on their toes, and I need to get them on their heels. And I usually tell them that the highway to the hips is through the heels.
Mm.
And when I hear lower back pain, I usually think that this person is one of a couple of things, emotionally or cognitively driven into that is a big one with low back pain, especially if it's just chronic, or they're the person that keeps like quote unquote throwing out their back.
Mm.
It's sort of like, and I highly recommend that everyone read John Sarno's work on that front. John Sarno is at NYU, and he's someone that a lot of people don't like to talk about. He coined the term tension myositis syndrome, or TMS, and he essentially said that it is. This is again going into autonomics as the driver for this stuff, but that it's the connections between the subconscious brain and the autonomic nervous system that are driving the show with back pain. And what's happening is the subconscious brain, he says, is the storehouse of unwanted emotions, or it's like the warden of the jail cell of the prisoner emotions that you don't want to deal with. So you just kind of sweep those things under the rug. They get filtered into the subconscious brain, and unfortunately, they don't just stay there and be cooperative and nice, but instead it causes the subconscious brain in some way to activate the autonomic nervous system in a way that's going to increase sympathetic tone. And when we increase sympathetic tone, we pump out epinephrine and norepinephrine into the circulation. And what those substances do is they'll bind to receptors at local muscles, and they will cause the blood vessels at those areas to constrict. And when those blood vessels constrict, you can't get as much blood and oxygen to those tissues. And we know very little about chronic pain, but we do know that chronically low oxygen levels always are present in tissues that hurt. So, it's one of those things where that's one of the things that first jumps out at me is like, am I dealing with someone that's a secretly angry person or a repressed person who's unable to deal with their repressed emotions?
And maybe self-medicating against those in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, for sure. Like Sarno takes it sort of one step further in saying that, like, what's interesting is pain. It gets all tied up with like the brain is a very interesting thing, but the more you get into the way that the brain works, it's almost like motor and sensory are one and the same. There's really no distinguishment between them. It's like sensory is largely based on like feedback from the brain. Like the brain talks within itself, and it's like a layered hierarchical structure. Sensory information is coming in, and it gets processed and sent up the layers of the cortex, but then the top layers of the cortex send projections back down to the bottom layers of the cortex, so that you are able to predict what's going to happen next. And if you think about the motor cortex is like the signal starts at the top and it gets sent down the projections and then down to the spinal cord. So we're either talking ascending or descending information in the brain. And so motor is really just kind of like a prediction, like behavior and prediction aren't that different from each other. Behavior is just a motor prediction, and everything sensory predictions are just descending sensory information, staying within the sensory tracks. Anyways, like what Sarno says with this is that you would actually rather feel physical pain than feel the emotional pain that would be associated with these concepts. So you never willingly acknowledge the subconscious drivers, and instead you would rather mask those things by feeling and experiencing chronic pain.
Wow.
And he has the highest success rate with dealing with low back patients of anybody that's ever operated in that world. So there's quite a bit to his concepts, both from like a physiology soundness and from a success rate.
Right.
And then I usually think like, well, there's probably a mechanical component to it as well. And
All right, let me ask real quick on the Sarno type stuff. To Tio's question, are you trying to implement some of those same strategies, or are you just thinking like I need to get him to that guy, or what's kind of your thought process there, or is it just
you
like oh
know,
you need to work on your mental
my
state?
first thought is, this is probably someone that thinks too much, and it's probably someone that actually, while they're thinking too much, they're very inaccurate and wasteful in their thinking. They never actually get to the real deal.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like I usually have very tough love for those people. It's like those are the people that I'll drag around and make fun of, and all that kind of stuff. And I'm waiting to see if they explode back at me or fight back.
Yeah.
And they usually never do. And then after I've been kind of like pistol whipping this person for a while, I will all of a sudden be nice. And then I'll actually ask them questions. I'll tell them what I'm doing. I'll be like, listen, you've been letting me insult you. You've been letting me kind of like publicly humiliate you. Why is that okay for you?
Yeah.
And I'll try to make them as comfortable as possible in that setting. And then I'll usually tell them something that I don't like about myself. And then that usually gives them the confidence to be able to start opening up.
Mm.
And it's almost like then I'll typically explain what I just explained to you to them. And one of the most common things you can do with people like that is like an anger journal or a rage journal. And because here's the thing, like they'll make the connection, like every time their back starts to hurt, they're actually angry.
Mm.
And it's like, when your back starts to hurt, I want you to pause and I want you to think what's actually really bothering you. And I want you to identify that. And I want you to begin to realize that this whole back pain thing is actually like an actor that is, wearing a mask to hide from the real thing that's bothering you. And it's amazing how successful that is. It's simple. All you have to do is begin to acknowledge that, make the associations, and you can almost look at the pain scornfully at a certain point.
Right.
And like, you're a silly phantom that is very untruthful and actually like misdirecting me from being able to accurately appraise the situation.
It's an interesting way of dealing with it because it's actually pretty close to a lot of the strategies in nutrition coaching. When you look down to it, it's like the three things you really want to give someone are autonomy, competence, and belonging. And so you're giving this person autonomy because after you kind of go through the experiment, so to speak, you're like, well, you're in control here. I'm going to give you this journal. This is ultimately like you're going to have to deal with this. I'm not going to just do it for you, and you can deal with this. It's kind of your decision. Competence because you're sort of explaining, giving them information that they can do it. Sort of that growth versus fixed mindset that they can actually overcome this, and then belonging because you're even though at first kind of going about it in a little bit of a different way, but ultimately you're sharing, being vulnerable about yourself, and then giving them that support. And so it's sort of is funny that that's the way you go about it because it's a very similar kind of coaching strategy. It's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm. And like from that mechanical standpoint as well, I would say that and again, most of these things go back to threat. Ultimately, threat is the common denominator. It's like what I'm talking about is like the emotional elements and the cognitive elements driving the threat loop. But there's also like, again, if you've lost joint variability, that's another threatening situation because now if you move in certain directions, you can't access certain joints to assist with that. And that's increasing the likelihood that something bad could happen. And your brain like registers that and it locks you down even more. So it's like you've lost degrees of freedom someplace. And I usually start thinking that there's just zero frontal plane
Hmm.
at a pelvis and at a ankle foot complex. And it's like, well, how do I open that up? And it's like, well, if you follow kind of the PRI thought process, you need to first establish proper sagittalism, which is based on getting 10 degrees of dorsiflexion, 30 degrees of lumbar lordosis, and 30 degrees of cervical lordosis, which is super hard to measure. But if you achieve those things, theoretically, it should unlock some frontal plane mechanics, which you can see through like an adductor drop test. And once you've given that person some level of frontal plane, now you have access of being able to retrain the frontal plane on some level,
Hmm.
which means that you have to train muscles like adductors and posterior glute medius and serratus and things like that. And once you've trained muscles of the frontal plane, at least in the PRI model, the best way to maintain and hold on to proper sagittalism is to establish frontal plane control. And that frontal plane control is like a buffer or a level up above sagittal positioning.
Right.
And if you can simply get the person to do their daily movements and utilize a frontal plane, then it should maintain sagittalism.
Right.
And again, all of this stuff from a pain standpoint is based on reducing threat input.
Right. Yeah, and that's as kind of a newbie in getting more and more into a lot of the PRI concepts. Although I've been doing them for quite a bit of, like, very diligently doing a lot of deliberate practice for about 2 years now, and I still feel like I'm just barely starting to, like, okay, like every day I'm just like, wow. I really one thing I was thinking about was the very first seminar you gave. You kind of talked to the room and said, okay, who in here like knows PRI or like does PRI? And like half the people raise their hand, and you're like, okay, well, who's actually been to a PRI course? And like 2 or 3 people raise their hand, and you're like, okay, so no one actually really knows and does PRI. And so it's like, it's kind of such a rabbit hole. And one thing I've been trying to stay with as a kind of a younger fitness professional is like not, definitely not falling into dogmatism and staying open-minded and not being like, okay, well, this is the only way to think about it. Like, oh, it's a problem. Oh, well, let me try and get you neutral, and maybe that's the only answer. It's like, well, it's a big world out there. And so before we get into kind of this next topic, it's like we're going to talk about like for me, I actually your Facebook post is really like a blog, and it is so helpful to me to like, say I'm having an issue with a client, like left shoulder. I'll literally just type into Facebook, Pat Davidson left shoulder, and there'll be like 4 or 5 very long posts. It's literally like a little Google engine for me of stuff, and I'm like, well, Pat probably did a post about it, and I'll learn, either through your post or the comments quite a bit, and so.
I didn't know you could do that on
Yeah,
Facebook.
it's cool, and I think their search is getting a lot better. So it'll show you certain comments where you talked about it, and it's actually really very usable. So so yeah, I was kind of thinking, we're going to talk a little bit about sacred cows and Swiss cheese, and obviously we're going down the rabbit hole on some stuff, and like I just want to frame this a little bit as like, last week I was on YouTube. And there was this thing said like Turkish billionaire playboy gains muscle. And so of course I'm like, oh yeah, I want to see that. And this billionaire rolls up in a Maserati, whatever. He gets out and goes to this gym, like $2 million facility, just like beautiful, beautiful gym. And this like 6'2" blonde supermodel proceeds to put him on a treadmill for 30 minutes, and then just kind of like watch him walk for a little bit, just kind of talk to him. Then he's like, all right, today he's going to do the machine chest press for 1 set of 12 reps. And like it proceeds to do just the most ridiculous workout with this billionaire. And I'm like, man, if we are still kind of quote unquote arguing, but just discussing a lot of stuff about the nuances of training. But I think even if you're on the radar of being in the discussion of lateral band walks or anything like that, like you're probably good. You're probably
Mm-hmm.
not the 99% of training that's out there. And so I think it's just important to be like, to kind of call that out and be like, okay, if you're even in that realm in the first place, then it's probably, you're probably a good, overall good person.
Yeah.
So,
And this is something that reminds me a great deal of a conversation I had with Derek Hansen on his podcast. Because, that was one where I was sort of saying that, like, what you do in training doesn't really matter that much. But what does matter is that people try hard. And the only way anybody's going to try hard, from my experience, is if they're given something to do and they believe in it. And the way that people are more likely to believe in things is if I'm coaching them and I have a very specific reason and I can explain why I need you to do something in this very specific way, that is going to sell that to that person on a level that nothing else possibly could.
and you have to believe in it
Like 100% have to believe in it.
because they'll pick it up.
Yeah. Like, so it's like the more educated, the more time I spend learning about the things that I want people to do and exactly why I want them to do it, and I build this model of the whole concept, and I can explain to them exactly why they need to be doing this thing, they're going to try so much harder when they're doing it. And that trying is really going to be the thing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's not to say that some things aren't better than other things. But I think that, I've got enough experience working with normal human beings and even athletes to realize that most of them either don't have the attention span, or B, the capabilities of being able to execute a lot of the fine detail things that I would love to get them to do from a biomechanics standpoint.
Right.
And so as a result, if someone watches a training session that I'm doing with someone, it's not going to look drastically different from a training session to do with practically anybody else, except they might not see some of like the little warm up things. You know what I
Right.
mean? Like typically it's really funny. A session with me, at least in like a personal training realm, is either going to start with like, we're just going to be moving the whole time. So we're going to hop right into an aerobic modality, or we're going to start with bench press. Like the first thing you're going to do is you're going to just do reps, warm up reps with the bench press. Like there's nothing that precedes that.
Right.
Like we're going to start in the fitness that we're going to develop today.
And for me, I'm 100%, like, I was never an athlete. I'm not really excited about athletes. If someone comes to me and they're an athlete, they want to train, I'm calling Aaron Davis. Like, I like working with just everyday people, which I'm passionate about. I love it. And so
Yeah.
one thing that resonated with me was, especially like you were talking about the bench press, it's like, well, these people do just need to feel something. They can feel the bench on their back. And you could argue, it's like,
Yep.
oh, it's not the best thing for, gin pop. It's like, well, their feet are on the floor. They can feel the palmar, the arch of their hand. And we'll get into bench press in a bit. But it's like,
Yeah.
kind of, I think that's such a good perspective. Is like, what are they going to want to do? What can they get excited about? And what can you get them excited about? Because you're, first excited about it. So, kind of on that realm. So sacred cows. And, now we've kind of framed that, whatever you're doing, it's probably okay. Now we'll just have some fun, get into the minutia that the nerds like to talk about. So
Yep.
let's start off kind of just what is your definition of a sacred cow, and why do you think, those sort of things even exist in the first place?
I think that first I have to give credit to Bill Hartman for really making this the conversation, because he's been starting off a number of his presentations with like, you need to question your mentors and you need to question sacred cows. So sacred cows are these things that like we just all accept. It's like, and they're probably at the level of subconscious within the world of training. Like they just things that everybody does.
Oh, yeah.
They don't even begin to think about. And it's like, what I like about this is that the smart people in the world of training and fitness for a long time have been saying, like, you need to take a look at everything you do in your programming, and if you can't come up with a good reason for why it's in there, you have to throw that thing out. And that's all I'm doing. It's just that I'm actually just trying to identify things that people are so bought into, and maybe there's things that are kind of pieces of crap,
Right.
or they just don't have the like the lateral band walk. I think is a great example. Okay, because it's like so easy to defend that thing. You could
Right.
be like frontal plane glute med, boom, done. Like those things. Those things are great. Those things are good. Everybody needs those things. And
Yeah.
it's like, are you actually developing anything about a positive frontal plane with that thing? No, you're not, because I've watched a million people do those things. And is it possible to develop a good frontal plane with that? It 100% is. But the chances are that there's a 99.99% percent, like you have, like almost every coach I see has no idea what a frontal plane actually is.
Right.
That's really the truth of the matter. I see people put the band on. I see them move a leg sideways, and I see their thorax go forward. I see them go into extension. I see them strain and turn on a neck. I see them not. I see them have their arms down by their side, and their hands are balled up into tight fists. They're
Right.
gripping, they're tensing, they're holding on for dear life, and that is the opposite of a frontal plane. If you want to see what a frontal plane looks like, it looks like people having fun dancing. That's exactly what it looks like. Exactly. Because a frontal plane is an axial skeleton driven phenomenon where you have ilium bones that are moving up and down like a seesaw, and you have necks that are bending side to side with lateral flexion, and you have a rib cage that is abducting and adducting, and you have a thoracic spine that's laterally flexing.
Right.
It's something that spontaneously emerges when people are having fun, from my experience. Like, I can remember going to some sports games. I remember going to a New Jersey Devils game, and the Devils scored a goal, and they flash up like the fan cam, and it just showed like these kids that were Devils fans, and it was like the most unbelievable frontal plane I've ever seen. Like, they were just like wiling fucking out, man. Like, like wrists were going in frontal plane. It was like the little kid like making fun of you dance move.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
And yeah, like totally. And it's like that's a frontal plane.
Yeah.
It is not locking every structure up that you possibly can. I think another example when people need to see these things
and feel them. I think too,
Mhm.
like because like I talked about to you was like before I worked with my boy, shout out Zach Couples, best virtual.
He is the man.
He will Skype in to you or your client's house and just zap. It's like amazing
Yeah.
what he can do with resets. So like I had been trying forever to find and feel my left foot, my left hip. I could even just while I'm doing dishes, while my like right calf and right butt would start getting hot, and I'm like, man, I wish I could do this. And I tried tons and tons of stuff, and then when he went in there with surgical precision and actually got me over into that left side through
Hmm.
a few graduated steps, it's like, oh, and maybe I had been able to put it into words before, but until you really feel what that feels like, you're like, oh
Yeah.
shit, now I kind of get what that shifting means.
Yeah, I can see you using the hands. It's like puppet strings almost. You know what I mean? Like I see a pelvis and it's like one side has to ascend and the other side
Right.
has to descend. And at the same time, I need to see the three S bones over the big toe of the stance foot. It's like if we want to get you into authentic left stance with a frontal plane, which is the hallmark of mid stance, I need you on your left foot, on your left heel, on your left big toe. I need to see that the left ASIS, the left hip bone, is higher in space than the right hip bone. I need to see that your sacrum, sternum, and sphenoid are centered over your left big toe. And I need to see you that you're doing this and not extending.
Mm.
I need to see that you're maintaining kind of that closed scissor phenomenon of the belt line and the rib cage in the front. Because, it's, excuse me, when people, like Ron Huruska calls the frontal plane the plane of compensation. So it's like when people you are not experiencing frontal plane if you are going into compensation, and you will compensate by compensating in the sagittal plane. Like you will just simply extend. Like if you manage to actually, if someone that's incompetent in the frontal plane will attempt a frontal plane move, and they will compensate in the sagittal plane by just simply the thorax moves too far forward or the cranium moves too far forward. And when the cranium moves too far forward, that person's going to be locking up in a neck. And if the thorax and the lumbar spine is moving too far forward, that person is going to be locking up with a psoas. Versus actually moving into the frontal plane and then being able to stay in some level of flexion in the sagittal plane, which will make you incredibly unstable.
Right.
You know, that's the thing, is good frontal plane is unstable. You're on the brink, and you have to learn to become okay with being on the brink and using muscles to be able to go there rather than, because what I'm talking about when people are either occluding with like a sternocleidomastoid in the neck or scalenes or whatever, they're creating a clamp, an occlusion clamp. And a psoas muscle can create the same kind of occlusion clamp at the lumbopelvic femoral complex. Or we're talking about patho people that just simply lock out joints and stabilize themselves by getting to end range joint positions and just kind of being bone on bone impingement strategy.
Right.
So it's, and a lot of this will be terminology that people are just like, what's this?
Yeah, it's like there's a little bit of almost a prerequisite to, but that's what it's for the nerds. That's what we want.
Yeah, for sure, man. Like some topics are probably for the 99% out there, and other topics are for like 1%. And I've never been afraid of teaching to the one kid in class who's the smartest kid, because that kid's probably going to go out there and do something amazing with his career.
Right.
And he or she probably needed to hear that one little bit of information that just like completely unlocked that next level for them.
Yeah. I mean, that's part of the reason I'm doing this is like, I'm just so interested in all these kind of rabbit hole topics. And like, I know there's a lot of people like me out there, especially working with, just everyday people trying to get them better. And there can be this, once you really get into the complexity, like being able to extrapolate, pull back, and like know the simple side of that complexity. And one thing too that I saw a quote that was like, "Simple ideas ignore biological complexity." So like just saying lateral band walk, front plane glute med. It's like, well, I'm gonna have to write paragraphs to actually try and
it's the worst.
Get to where we can be on the same page, but. Cool. So
and again, like let's
no. I like it, but
because it's like you can get into these arguments, and the simple explanation for a complicated biological system that's wrong is the people that are just like, well, the EMG evidence clearly shows that the banded walk will ramp up activity in glute med, and it's like, great. Now I'm going to recruit a muscle that is out of position to be doing a joint action, which is going to be femoral abduction on a pelvis that's in the wrong position. I'm going to be ramping up its activity to do that. So I'm going to be recruiting and fatiguing fibers, which, simple, like I think it's Starling's law of neural activity says that once you recruit a fiber, it's easier to re-recruit that same fiber. So again, it's plasticity. Like I'll get better at doing it bad. And especially if I'm ramping up EMG activity to a very high level, it just shows that I'm really recruiting a ton of fibers.
Right.
And it's like, again, it's kind of like when you really get into the weeds of EMG, you'll see that what you're like the ultimate desirable end product is pick any motor task you can possibly come up with. Let's, for ease, just say back squatting 300 pounds. And I would put I would measure EMG on like glutes and quads, for instance. And whoever is able to show me the lowest EMG in those muscles for executing that movement is the winner.
Right.
Like if in reality, like, and let's compare this on a day-to-day basis. Let's say I'm measuring someone's ability to squat 300 pounds and I'm using EMG to track the muscle activity. And today you give me this imaginary number, let's just say of 75 on the EMG to be able to squat 300 pounds. And then tomorrow you give me 125 in your EMG to squat 300 pounds. I would say that today compared to yesterday, you are way worse off. You have to use so much more energy. You have to ramp up your system so much more to accomplish the same task. You're actually being much more inefficient. Your readiness to train is way down. And like you are compensating. You are compensating from a central neural drive standpoint. And so it's kind of like the higher the EMG for a muscle to accomplish a task, I'm either thinking that muscle is behaving out of position or you're fried from a nervous system standpoint.
Got it.
So that it's never a good argument to me. Like, oh, the EMG is better.
Yeah. Makes a lot of sense. So I've got dopamine, and you're kind of getting known as the dopamine guy a little bit. So there's a ton of questions, a lot of lateral, ways to take this on dopamine. But one thing I really like is like the dopamine-driven program design, right? And so this is built into, Mass 1 and Mass 2, I think. Probably more so Mass 1, would you say? Or is it?
They're both pretty similar on that front. Yeah.
And so my question is, and I as far as my understanding of how that dopamine-driven program design works, it's like people will achieve mastery. You give them something they complete, they get a sense of competence, and then you're ultimately taking that away so that they do fail, and then they'll do anything to try and get that feeling back. That feeling of success, anything almost. There's like a crazy, the crazy monkey. And
Correct.
So with Gen Pop, because that's like all of my questions always are going to revolve around mom and dad, right? That's like all I care about. And so with them, is it sort of that same idea, or what does implementation look like? And with the folks that the everyday CEO or whatever it is that you kind of work with.
So it's like always to me, like, what's the goal? And sometimes I think that they don't even know what the goal is. Like, to me, the goal is behavioral change, and the specific behaviors I'm looking for, at least in the fitness realm, are that I'm trying to ultimately increase the volume and intensity of their physical displays. Plain and simple, really. Like, I need you to do more movement, and I need your movement to be better and more profound. And maybe you don't know why that's important, and that's okay with me. But like, why would I want that? Well, if I'm talking about Gen Pop, like from an aging perspective, we know that a couple of things are super important. Like the ability to maintain muscle mass as people age is like the most critical factor from like a health standpoint and like a longevity standpoint. And then second, like the ability to hold on to power seems critical. People will get weaker as they get older, and they'll get slower as they get older. And that combo leads to like it's a multiplication equation. So power is the thing that drops off the most when you have that combo of losing strength and speed. And when power falls off, like that's when there's a couple reasons why power is important. Number one, it's the most predictive factor in terms of people falling and breaking bones. And secondly, the thing that will ultimately keep you alive is a high VO2. Like VO2 is the most predictive variable for all-cause mortality. And when you get down to it, like people get old and they actually can't move fast enough to be able to display a high enough VO2.
Right.
Like they don't have enough locomotive muscle power to be able to propel themselves through space fast enough to actually raise their heart rate high enough so that they can pump out enough blood and extract enough oxygen from that blood.
So you're saying it's not necessarily because it's an aerobic or respiratory limitation, but more so like what that VO2 limitation is indicative of from a muscular and power standpoint?
Correct. Like a 90-year-old person, is incapable of moving fast enough to actually build up enough of a VO2.
Got it.
Like the top speed of that ship is like 2.1 miles an hour, and that's just not enough to actually drive. Like at a certain point, it's like
maybe not
like
enough to prevent a fall or function well.
Or just like they literally can't get a cardiorespiratory training effect because they can't move fast enough or with enough force. Like that's literally what it comes down to. So it's like the base of the pyramid is muscle tissue maintenance. And the reason for that is twofold. In one track of the flow sheet, it's power oriented, and power kind of feeds into fall prevention. And on the other side of it, it's that they can't get a cardiorespiratory training effect at a certain point because they don't have enough propulsive muscle to be able to actually create a stimulus for a VO2 response. So it's like, and people, the rate at which people drop off is kind of frightening.
Yeah.
Especially when you get older. So it's like, I need this person to become a lifelong exerciser, and I need them to do fairly well-rounded things in terms of like, I need you to stay strong, I need you to jump, I need you to sprint, I need you to be able to kind of fall and tumble. I need you to be able to do aerobic modalities. Because just because you're strong doesn't mean you can do aerobics. I'm a pretty good example of that. So it's like you need to maintain all these things. And so that's typically like what I'm thinking is the end product is, and it's like I'm fighting this fall off, so I have to fight upwards. Like I need to try to get you to do more to hold on to the middle between those two lines.
And the fall off being just kind of a product of aging and hormonal shifts and
reality. Yeah. Like it really probably comes down to just excuse me. Oxidation, like oxygen from the Cambrian explosion and revolution on this planet. Oxygen's kind of like a poisonous substance in many ways. We've just figured out how to adapt to it, but it's flammable. It destroys things. Things like probably existed for a lot longer on this planet before oxygen came about due to the emergence of plants. But that's a whole separate rabbit hole altogether. But we've figured out a way to coexist with oxygen due to the development of like a mitochondria being implanted into a cell. But ultimately, oxygen is the thing that's going to kill you in the end.
Right.
So it's like the more you can coexist with oxygen, probably the better. Which leads to like the whole concept of like mitochondrial health and overall longevity and all that sort of stuff. Excuse me. But if I'm going to be able to get you to increase your overall workload, I need to figure out a way to create that behavioral change. And when it comes to behavioral change, it really will always kind of revert back to dopamine. And when I start thinking about dopamine, you have to first identify and define these things. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, and as a neurotransmitter, it is secreted from dopaminergic neurons, and those neurons are present in a few really profound areas of the brain. One of those areas is the basal ganglia, which is the most prominent component of the motor system of the body. The second place where it's secreted is from
nucleus accumbens.
Nucleus accumbens. Yeah, excuse me. Let me just get a sip
go for it, bro.
Fluid here.
A little coffee and Jameson there, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so yeah, dopamine is motor at the basal ganglia. It is pleasure and reward at the nucleus accumbens.
Facebook likes.
100%.
Nucleus accumbens.
Mm-hmm. And then we've got these other two tracks that are sort of like these cult of personality areas. And one of them is the nigrostriatal tract, and the other one is the mesolimbic tract. So the like this mesolimbic tract is one that's associated with compulsivity, addiction, and sort of like a lot of times mental illness. Um, it's also associated with creativity, though,
Hmm.
so it's real tricky. And this lateral track, this nigrostriatal component, is associated with serious mindedness, ability to inhibit emotions, and goal directedness. It's almost like if you're in a stressful environment, you can stay focused and on task with that nigrostriatal tract. So the goal, generally speaking, is you want to, like, as adults, our cortex should be able to inhibit our emotional reactivity to stressful situations so that, as Robert Sapolsky would say, we can do the harder thing. That's sort of the
Like a
goal.
delayed
Like,
gratification.
yeah, the delayed gratification is 100% tied to this entire thing, and it's more living in that nigrostriatal lateral tract of this kind of cult of personality system that I'm talking about. So it's like when I'm trying to manipulate the dopamine system, I'm trying to get people to become focused and goal directed. And if I get that, they'll tend to inhibit the mesolimbic tract because that's what that nigrostriatal tract does. It sort of quiets the emotional reactive one. And like there's crossover with dopamine. You know what I mean? Like if I'm ramping up the dopaminergic system, I'm probably going to get some motor, I'm probably going to get some attention, I'm probably also going to get some of this kind of like craziness at the same time. So it's always like this, and also reward. That's tied to it as well. So if I can just get you to get rewarded by reaching goals, I think that's my interpretation of how I'm shifting you over towards this direction that we're looking for behavioral change for exercise. So the question is, how can I make a carrot that's big enough for you to pursue it? And it's kind of like, well, I need to make it meaningful for people. And I always think of like the climbing the mountain analogy in some ways. Like you climb a mountain, you feel like you accomplished something. Versus like if I did something that's sort of like anybody could do it, there's no real reward from that. It's not a
Right.
big deal. And that's kind of where the 30-30 fits in for me, is that you did, especially like rounds 1 and 2, like you should get all your reps. You're going to get 15 reps, and you did it 10 times. And then you get 50. You accomplish the task 20 times by the time you finish round 2. So you've got this history of having a goal and meeting that goal and liking to achieve that goal. There's a little reward every time you do it. Like maybe I'll say, "Great work, good job," or whatever it is that just drives that system a little bit. And then, of course, you get to round 3, where it's like, who knows what's going to happen in round 3. But if you can either complete round 3, which is what I'm looking for people to do at first, man, you just had like a workout that really challenged you, and you completed that thing, and that's incredibly satisfying for most people. Or B, you missed a couple of exercises. Maybe you got 14 reps on bench press or something like that. And you got really, really close, but you had probably 28 or 29 areas where you were successful and only one area where you didn't reach your goal.
Mm.
But that one area fits into what you were talking about before, which is the creation of the craving response. And it is when you get people to that craving response that they'll do anything they possibly can to re-achieve those goals.
Right.
Again, typically I want people to be successful with all 3 rounds on day 1. I want them to be successful with all 3 rounds on day 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to who knows how far out. But at a certain point, yeah, I'm gonna take that success away from you, hopefully in round 3, so that you're still based on mostly success. And it's almost like Las Vegas with pulling slot machines and stuff like that. You're not going to get hooked in and become a gambling addict if you win every time, there
Right.
has to be the element of potentially losing,
Yeah. No
and
light without the darkness.
the right ratio of losing, which seems to be about like anywhere between like 20, like winning anywhere between like 25% and like 70% or something along those lines, which I
Okay.
guess is probably the only reason that people stick with baseball, because like baseball, you just fail constantly in that
Right.
sport, with these brief moments of actually winning.
Love it. Cool. So we'll switch to a little bit of a different type of question for a second before we go. I have most of these are. I wanted to just steal all this first episode just for me. There's a lot more questions on Facebook that we'll get to later.
Yeah.
So the idea of kind of still on the dopamine train here, relationships. So like I think a
Mm,
lot about and have you posted some stuff about like the dating apps and the effect that may have on the brain. I think it's an amazing thing, right? A lot of people meet their significant other. It's great. Technology is great, but I think there's something to the just the search and the swipe and like the climbing of the mountain of like you have all these options. It's almost like the Coolidge effect where you're
hmm
seeing more mates than you would have seen in the wild, and therefore it's like constantly just hitting the brain. And the thing I see is a lot of people are sort of obsessed more with the search than the
hmm
actual like getting to know someone face to face. And so when it comes to the brain and relationships, and then also like thinking about the potential future of how this plays out with like artificial intelligence, and when you've
Yeah.
got something like Ben talked about you're sitting at home, you've got a fleshlight, and you're hooked up to VR, you're just like hanging out, and you've got this
Yeah.
virtual relationship. Like, how does that play out in your mind from like a dopamine brain perspective?
So I think when you consider dopamine, you have to at some point get into the asymmetry of the brain, and dopamine is primarily the neurotransmitter of the left hemisphere, versus like the dominant neurotransmitters of the right hemisphere are norepinephrine and serotonin. And norepinephrine and serotonin are your sympathetic neurotransmitters, and dopamine is your parasympathetic neurotransmitter, which seems to almost spit in the face of what most people think about in terms of like uh, this right brain that's like this artistic sort of thing. Like you have to learn art as a human being. Like it's not like you're born with a right brain that's artistic. It doesn't make any sense. It's like it would be the same thing as like your left brain is your language brain. You have to learn language. It's just that like you happen to usually send like the capability for doing that to the modules in the left brain, but those things could have learned anything. It's just that like with the advent of that particular task, they're suited for that brain. So it's almost like what is the outlook on the world of the two hemispheres? And the outlook of the on the world, and this is from Ian McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary. The left brain looks out at the world, and it is looking at objects, and it's thinking about how it can utilize those objects. And the word that McGilchrist uses a lot of the time is manipulation, because in truth, the left brain is the tool user's brain. Like it's associated with grasp, and it's associated with manipulation, and it's associated with making use of things. Okay, and you would be making use of those things in large part to change outcomes for your own benefit. And the other thing that dopamine is associated with is in the world of attention, and that attention is with focal vision and with far off objects, and it's all tied to the concept of abstraction. And abstraction is just removal from the here and now. Okay, and this is something that we developed as animals that left the ocean and moved to terrestrial ground, because like A fish is living in the water and you can't see as far in the water and it's murky. So a fish just simply swims into a new region. It can see a very short distance around itself and it simply reacts to the environment that it finds itself in now. Versus when you move from water to land, like you can see much farther on land than you can in water. So you need to develop all this new hardware that would be able to actually make use of far off information and be able to plan for what you're going to do once you physically move into that area. And so as like hunting animals, we rely quite a bit on distant focal vision. Okay. And again, like the brain is something where it's like it has these functions, but the functions are all tied together. So if I'm using focal vision, that means that I'm going to be living more in the realm of a dopaminergic brain. A dopaminergic brain is more of a left hemispheric brain. It's one that's associated with like grasp and manipulation and making use of things. And it's something that's more interested in the hunt than it is in the consummation of the hunt. You know, that's what's fun is like once I actually get the prize, it's not that much fun, but the acquisition of it for the left hemisphere is the show. So, right. You know, if I'm staring with focal vision at a screen that I'm holding in my hand and I'm able to potentially manipulate and use this thing to acquire these things that I'm looking for, it's just feeding into that system so powerfully. And, you know, the opposite side of the coin is really more this like right hemisphere. And when I think about the visual and the attentional components of the right hemisphere, it's a peripheral vision hemisphere and it's a peripersonal space hemisphere. It's really the older system that's associated with defense and also just like somatic information, like things that are close at hand, things that you can feel, things that are present, as opposed to things that are far off in the future that require planning and, you know, sort of like strategic thinking to be able to deal with. So it's like we just put ourselves in this state where we're relying and utilizing this left hemispheric dominance so much in modern society. And again, it's like it's a use it or lose it system with the brain. The more you use one side and use some components, the more likely you'll be to continue to use those things. And so in regards to Ben's concept, it's interesting. I mean, I've heard, I don't know if I have facts to back this up, but that Japan is actually having some issues with reproduction rates. And it's postulated that in large part because they're almost becoming addicted to pornography. You know, it's almost like how can real people compete with that? And I do think that ultimately we'll probably have like these motorized sex dolls or something like that and virtual reality helmets, and like, you know, you'll be able to recreate like scenes from Caligula's Rome or something along those lines. And it's almost like how could a human female compete with like the potential robotic multi-sensory kind of stimulation that could be provided from that. And in many ways, it's almost like from a species perspective, men are hunting out women in order to be able to have like sexual conquest. And what happens to women's behaviors when men have a readily available, you know, constantly changing stimuli, sexual apparatus available to them? I think that I don't know. Like, I mean, we never, like, the more you think you're able to predict the outcomes of the future, probably the more hopelessly lost you are, because as we move towards the future is just more random and chaotic than the present.
Right.
So it's never like you're going to be able to accurately assess what's going to happen. And the more things get different, the more they multiply and get progressively more different.
Right. And like it's, you know, sort of like in training with just the idea of, it kind of leads into the next thing I want to talk about is like entropy. And so it's like things are always breaking down, and whether you like it or not, like when you're seeing new types of training, you know, surfboard classes or just you know, weird stuff that you're like, what? How is that even a thing? Be like, well, it's only going to get weirder. And it's like, you can't get lost in worrying about it. Just have to sort of, do your thing. So that's awesome. So differentiation in training is something that I've been thinking about a lot listening to some of your previous podcasts where you sort of discuss, and this is actually something that I need to reflect on and maybe get some advice from for my own training methodology. And the idea being that like you have a phase of training that's more cortical, more learning, more sensory, and then a phase where you just want to get dumb and let it go, like rip it.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, I in my training have tried to do almost like an integrated approach where I'm almost putting those things together, and maybe it's the population I work with, and that their learning curve is they're doing this beginners, right, doing this maybe some movements for the first time, and so it is more of that sensory experience, and then one day they get to that just be able to train their face off and kind of stay in the game, so to speak. So I'm wondering kind of how has your thinking evolved on the differentiation concept, and what are some things you're thinking about on that?
So I always think like, what are the actual training models that exist? And like, generally speaking, there's concurrent periodization and there's conjugate or block periodization. And concurrent periodization is where you take a look at all of the available training means and methods that exist, and you sort of train those things at the same time all the time. Versus conjugate or block sequencing, where you focus on certain elements during a period of time while you pay less attention to some of the other elements. And there seems to be like defined time periods where each one of those models works better for different populations. And for advanced people, it seems as though like conjugate block training is kind of the way to go. And for beginner intermediate, it's interesting because some people will say that beginners do well with block, and really the land of the intermediate is where the concurrent model should fit, because it's almost like if you're going to learn something, you need to kind of focus on it initially, and it's like there's some good evidence to support that in terms of like memory consolidation and interference effects. It's like they'll do research with like people, and they'll teach them how to play like a song on a keyboard, and then they'll teach them how to play another song on a keyboard in a short period of time after they learn that, and then they'll retest them the next day. And it's like if you just played one song and didn't have to learn the other song, you would memorize the one song better as compared to trying to learn the two. Like the second song can be have an interference effect on your ability to learn the first one. So it's kind of like you don't want interference signals taking place if your primary goal is to teach people specific things. Like focus on a couple of things, let them learn those things. Once they've learned those things, they're maybe now in a category we could call intermediate. At that point, your best bet is to probably just train everything all at the same time, and they'll improve their fitness in that realm. Like they'll improve in all realms of fitness, versus a truly advanced person. Like at that stage, you need to actually focus on something if you're really going to develop it and accentuate it to the highest levels you can.
Right.
So that's usually my thought process with that stuff.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I usually also revert back to this thinking of truly like performance versus health.
Right.
And it's kind of like performance to me is the land of specificity, and it's also typically the land of non-oxidative adaptations, versus the land of health being general and the land of like oxidative development of tissues. So it's kind of like when I think about people that are, and it depends on the goals. Like if someone's goal is just to be healthy, like I want them to have joint variability and oxidative health.
Right.
That's with enough muscle mass to be able to support them for the long run through life, as we talked about previously.
Yeah, and that's what I really want to I would love to dive into that a little bit. Like, so
Mhm.
in that, are you kind of thinking just almost like a concurrent, like movement variability, oxidative capacity, and just overall hormonal health, or what was the? How do
Yeah,
you think of those three intertwined, or is there a sort of a hierarchy, or what is your
so
thoughts
again,
on that?
it's like to first address joint movement variability. Like the first thing I have to do is establish proper sagittalism so that I can unlock a frontal plane. And once I've unlocked a frontal plane, now I train the frontal plane so that I am best able to hold on to proper sagittalism. And once the person has frontal plane control, now they can kind of perceive the sensory experience of the transverse plane, which once you can perceive and hold and experience the transverse plane, that again is sort of like what allows you to hold on to frontal plane. So and as stress rises in someone's life, they probably drop off the planes in the reverse order. Like you'll lose transverse plane first, then you'll lose frontal plane, and then you've got less degrees of freedom. And you can think about it from the microcosm perspective to the macrocosm perspective. If I'm asking you to do this very light loaded exercise, it's usually pretty easy to hold on to all three planes. If I'm asking you to do a one rep max back squat, you probably should drop off transverse and frontal planes. I don't want you moving in those planes. That could be a disaster. I need you to reduce degrees of freedom and become a very sagittal ape and just push in a linear manner. Versus also like from a chronic stress level, I'll probably see the same thing in terms of overall loss of those planes played out in a bigger time period. And also I look at like table tests and like, because I mean, I spend enough time around people that train super hard, and you can see their table tests get worse if they're just moving towards like a overreaching state with hard training. But it's like once they recover from that overreaching, the table tests just spontaneously like come back to where they should be.
Mm,
Um, but it's almost like if your performance will never reach super high levels if you're at the peak of health,
right,
because the peak of health to me means that you're probably very similar to like a primitive human that lived in the wild.
right.
And while they probably would have been very impressive, they also probably wouldn't have been able to show you a 40-inch vertical or be able to like clean and jerk 400 pounds
Yeah,
or something along those lines. But they would have been able to do a million things pretty good.
right.
Uh,
And that's sort of what I'm honestly like. I think it's easy for some folks who say that they're more in the health world, maybe, are like, health is my number one goal. They hang out with a lot of really strong people who have more of the
mhm.
performance goal, and it's like, well, is that really what you want? And that's I'm more in the like, I want to be somewhat jacked, but it's more important to me to be like the captain of Team Transverse, which I'm
Yep.
working my way up to with and so it's like, and that kind of thing. It's like it's not necessarily a bad thing. I think there's a little bit of a stigma too around,
Hmm.
especially in the, like big man strength coach world. That's like, oh, you're not trying to get the 400-pound back squat. It's like, well, not
Yep.
really,
Right.
you know.
Yeah, it makes sense.
And
So,
it's also
you
the
know,
world I live in with my people. And I think the more the coaches that are more drawn to like being passionate just about the gin pop and like just getting beginners. I do think it's somewhat important to kind of walk that walk a little bit, or at least get there one time. Know what that feels like to walk up the algorithm, and then you know.
hmm So, just to try to get as close to specifically answering the specific question that you had in terms of how I would do that with people,
Mm,
I would try to pick as many different aerobic modalities as possible
mm,
and have that person do those things in their training session once I've unlocked those planes. And it's like I don't care, like I have no affiliation towards certain machines or anything like that, but I would think along the lines of like if I had access to these things in a gym, I would for sure make use of them. Number one, I love the Jacob's ladder. It puts people into flexion and it makes them crawl for like however long you want to make them crawl. Number two, I love the Versa Climber. It's like a salamander going up and down a ladder over and over again. I love the slide board. It is like, if you coach that thing well, like everything that I put in that MedBall article on developing planes is living in a slide board.
Okay, we have to talk about that because and for the people who don't know, like, just Google Pat Davidson. I think it's triplanar control MedBall. It'll come up. It's on Dark Side Strength. I mean, that should be like an $800 product. Like, it really is, and it's free, and it's so good. Once you can even just watch the videos. If you haven't dug into PRI for a while, I think some of the text may get a little weird, but if you can just watch the videos, and watching Pat coach and cue this guy through, and it's just very very easy, nice, focused cueing on how to get him to find and feel the right things is just amazing. So on that point, with the slide board, what might be some examples, because that's like the only piece of conditioning equipment I use. So for me and my clients, what are kind of some ways you do that?
So when I'm coaching that thing, like, the person is, we're working first on the stance part of the thing. So the person is like, the outside of their foot is up against the wooden lateral border of the slide board. And it's like, I'm telling them, like, you need to feel your heel against that wooden board, okay? And let's say your left foot is against that board. I want them to reach their right hand forward, and I want them to feel themselves acquire more of their left heel and acquire, like, more of moving into their left hip, okay? And then, like they
driving
push.
Posterior with the hip.
Yeah, for sure. And then they push, they go across to the other side. And, like, I'll just focus on the stance foot first. And then once they're starting to get that, this concept of, like, opposite hand reach puts you into, like, essentially passive AFIR and puts you into that heel. Like, they're like, oh yeah, my butt is, like, cooking over here. Like, this is unbelievable. And then I start working on, like, the actual push mechanics and getting into the frontal plane. So it's like, as you're pushing against that board, you need to finish by pushing through the arch and pronating the foot. And that's going to shoot you into the other side. Okay, so then it's like, after we figure that out and they start to, like, experience that, like, different kind of, like, posterior glute med frontal plane abduction component, now it's like we find and feel the swing of the arms and the way that you switch arms as you're sliding across that board. And I also, like, really try to, like, some people, they just extend through the back as they're getting into each hip and stance. And with those people, I'll coach them a little differently. I'll coach them almost like if they're throwing a baseball. And, like, in the follow through, I'll have them follow through as if they're throwing a baseball.
That's good.
So that they flex in the trunk while they're getting into the stance side, like heel and hip.
That's good.
And then some people are like what you'd call listers, where they are getting their pelvis to go left, but their trunk just shoots right. With those people, I have to focus a little bit more on, like, almost telling them to, like, crunch into the same side abs as they're doing as the foot that's against the board.
Right. I love it.
But ultimately, that thing is just money. Once I start hearing people be like, "Oh my God, this is all abs and butt," I'm like, "Yeah, you got it. And we're gonna just keep doing this thing."
So,
but I also go ahead.
For a lot of those aerobic modalities, the thing those all have in common is they're dealing with kind of that shifting, reaching, alternating, reciprocal type thing. So, I mean.
And, like, reaching in different directions, you know what I mean? Like, that slide board could be reaching forward for some people that have great control, or it could be reaching down for other people that need more flexion. The Jacob's ladder, you just can't screw up. Like, it just
do you think aerobic modalities that are more, like, let's take a ski erg, that's more two-hand, is that, would you want to modify that to be more like, okay, pull one at a time, or what are kind of your thoughts there?
Like, again, like, once the person, if you can just show me that you've got competence, we can do a million things. Like, that's where even, like, I've been known as somebody that kind of knocks handstands. But if you want to do those, as long as you like understand sagittal control and what that actually is, go do those things and extend all you want. Like have fun, extend, do those things. Like extension, there's nothing wrong with extension.
Right.
I just don't want you living there. And I don't want you telling me that you're fixing shoulders by putting people in extension upside down. Like that to me is like what I had against it.
Right.
But
you have a pretty nice handstand though. So
yeah, I mean, I can somehow actually do it, even at like over 200 pounds and locked up. Like, I can figure out a way to compensate into it. Is that a good idea for me? Maybe, maybe not. But yeah, it's sort of like I'm like doing things to like maintain muscle mass, which is to me like the land of the sagittal plane for strength and hypertrophy.
Right.
It's simple. It's stressful. It's basics. It's just doing the basics well. And then I'm going to put you into aerobic modalities that are going to do every possible movement I can think of, as long as you've still got this ability to show me the proper planes.
Right.
And like sensory motor competency in those planes.
One thing you talked about on Robbie Bork's show was like sneaking in some biomechanics and sensory work into like tempo or oxidative work. Are you still referring to the aerobic work, or is that more like the oxidative push up and oxidative?
Yeah, that's more
four
like
up, four down type thing.
Yeah, exactly. That's where. But it's a great place to sneak that stuff into for sure.
How would you do that? Or what are kind of some examples that you like to?
So, I love the goblet squat for it, but I have my own little special twist on the goblet squat where I'll have somebody put a yoga block between their elbows while they're holding onto the kettlebell. And that thing is just like the serratus murderer.
You'll have them squeeze it and then protract?
Yeah. And it's like they just feel abs the whole time. And then like for people that, for instance, like need to find certain spots of their feet, like oftentimes I'll just like fold up a Kleenex and put it into heels and arches when appropriate. And it's like I need you to hold on to those abs, and I want you through every millimeter of the range of motion of the squat as you're bending your knees. You need to find and feel those Kleenexes against your feet, and it just sort of. They're just like stuck in that thing for like a minute, and they're just feeling those things the whole time.
Right.
So it's that, and like I use step up sometimes for that. Like, put your left foot up on the box and touch your right elbow to your left knee. Push through your left heel and see your left hand in front of your face at the top. And it's kind of like you're twisting the whole time.
Oh, I love that. It's like the cross connect type. So good. Yeah.
And it's like we're just going to do 5 minutes of step ups, and every single time I want you to find and feel that. So it's like at a certain point you just need volume to be able to like hold on to these biomechanical concepts.
And what we're talking about here, and like the reason that you wrote that article was like the question you were always getting, which is, the question I feel like I ask everyone that has been training with kind of looking through the PRI lens. The question everyone asks is like, okay, well, how do you integrate it? How do you integrate it in a training session? How do you integrate with people that aren't too thrilled about balloons? Like, I think Lucy Hendricks and I are kind of, we talk about like imposing our will on people. We're like, I'm sorry, you're going to lay down and blow this balloon up. But at the same time, you're like, well, they're getting some fitness and you're really sneaking in. It's the old trainer idea of like give people a whole lot of what they want, but also, a lot of what they need. And if you can do that at the same time, then you're in the business. And so it's funny you even say the step up thing. I actually did that with a client. It worked great, like doing a lot of those same cues you used on those videos about coiling into the hip, feeling it, but not compensating, this way. And it's like all these same ideas that, if you have seen a lot of the techniques and activities as far as repositioning and restoration type stuff, you've seen a lot of those same, kind of like skeleton handout ideas of like how to get someone there, but then taking it another step, the next level is super beneficial and a cool way to kind of get it in.
So many things clicked into me with after the first 2 times that I took the vision course, because that's where they cover the topic of centering. And to me, it's like that's such a critical thing. And that's sort of what I was talking about before, where it's like, can you get on your left foot and be able to not extend while you put your sacrum, sternum, and sphenoid, or your zipper, belly button, and nose over the big toe of the foot that you're standing on?
Right.
It's like, man, once you sort of see that and like see how most people can't do it on one or both sides, it's a game changer. And like any opportunity that I can to like put people, center them over each foot, like first of all, their muscles just cook. So they're not questioning like, is this a good exercise? They're like, oh my God, yeah, like
Shaking.
yeah.
That's what I want.
So yeah, it's like, man, I am drilling like a million birds with this boulder right now. I'm getting so many positive effects from this.
And it's fun.
I'd say the hard part is just to like keep the person's neck from firing up in most of those things.
Yeah.
It's like I almost think of PRI as like the how to keep your neck off discipline.
Yeah. So what do you kind of do to do that?
Well, it's really tricky because like with some people, they just can't keep a neck off. So it's like I oftentimes go to hands with that. Yeah, like you see the same, like people just grip, like they hold on, or like it's like I just think of gripping and necks as being tied together.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, here's another sacred cow, like people using like really hard grip kettlebell exercises to try to fix shoulder things. And I'm like, man, you're just feeding into the problem, because so many shoulder things are driven through a neck, and all those neck muscles, like, coming down from either the occiput in the back of the head, or coming down the front and attaching to the collarbone.
Yeah,
like,
and you would mean like maybe like
an
heart.
arm bar, or
Okay.
a waiter's carry, any of those things. Like when
Yeah.
people are telling me like, I'm doing this thing in order to help my shoulder health.
Now, what about an arm bar that is more like an open hand and just a reach?
I'm cool with that.
Okay.
Like I'm generally speaking, it's like,
Yeah.
but the minute that you start gripping and like using the hand to clench like that,
Right.
it's the brachial plexus, which is coming straight out of the neck.
Got it.
And so many of those things are tied to it. It's like, you have to, if you stop breathing while you're doing a drill, you're clenching somewhere. It's all tied together. Your blood pressure is going up. And it's like all this neuroplastic rewiring and like learning mechanisms of associating these things together.
Right.
Of like trying hard, gripping, clenching, holding your breath.
And it's important to point out, we're not talking about fitness.
Correct.
We're purely talking
But it could be. Like, there's so many people that, like, fitness is only fitness is if I'm trying hard. And these are the same people that I watch do, like, exercises, like the first rep of, like, a 12-rep max set, and they're already making these crazy faces. Their eyes are, like, scrunching. Their jaw is working overtime. They're yelling. They're like, resorting to all these things. It's like, dude, you're bench pressing with your freaking orbicularis oris. Like, stop it. Let your face be relaxed. You don't need your face to make your arms move.
Right.
And it's like, that's going to be parasitic in terms of like, you have to feed oxygen to all of these muscles that are working super hard. Like,
right.
And you're learning to tie all these things together. I need you to learn to use only that which you need to accomplish that which you want to do. And I also need you to not use that which is going to be unnecessary for that which you're trying to do.
So is that a little bit of like the high threshold, low threshold idea?
Or, I don't even know if it's that, or if it's just like plain and simple, like you don't need that stuff to accomplish this task. And if you're using that stuff to accomplish this task, you have to feed that stuff. It needs oxygen. It needs blood, because it's working. So don't have it work.
Yeah.
Just have what you need to work,
yeah.
And you'll be much more efficient, economical. You'll get more done.
I did a workout with Dr. Mike T. Nelson, and I came from more of like the hard style school. And so we're training. He's like, "Are you okay?" like,
Yeah.
like, just like every rep, he's like, "Hey, just chill out." like, just let your
Yeah.
face
Yeah.
go. And it really, but it's a little bit of like very much an ingrained habit. It's something I
Hmm.
have to like notice and name and be like, okay, I'm doing the crazy face again.
And like, trust me, when you need it, you'll use it.
right, right.
But can you learn to not use it when you don't need it?
Yeah, cool. Um, all right. So before we kind of talk a little bit about a quick preview of what we got coming up, I wanted to ask about your next book. You're working on kind of a Mass 3 type thing. I don't know if you're going to call it that, but do you want to say anything about it or give us any nuggets of
You
what's
know,
going
you know,
down in
I,
the.
I haven't started anything yet.
Got it.
And in like, it's always interesting. Like, 90% of the podcasts I do, I get sort of the same questions, and one of the ones that always comes up is like, why did you write Mass One? Why did you
Right.
write Mass Two?
Right.
And it's like, I don't want to like go down that because I've covered it so many
Yeah.
times, but
Yeah.
like, I wrote Mass One for an intern at Men's Health.
Right.
And then like I started doing the program, and then a bunch of other people started doing the program. Like I would just send it to people, and then they'd post videos. And then Men's Health was like, "This is a pretty sick program, and we
Mm-hmm.
want to name this thing like Program of the Year." And I was like, "Cool, let me write a book and make money off of your advertising for me." And then I wrote Mass 2 because I'm trying to open up this group fitness business concept in New York. And it's like I've raised a certain amount of money, and it's not enough money to open the business. And it's really hard to find rich people that are potential investors that are like, yeah, I'm going to give you money. And so I was like, I need to find a new investor. Oh, wait, I've got an investor inside my head because I can write a book and raise money through that book.
Right.
And it's like, so I've always done these things because out of like need or necessity or pressure or time or all these things that like have always been the reason that I've ever done anything. Like I've never done anything just because it's like, oh, maybe I'll just do this thing. It's like, oh shit, like this thing's due. I need to get on this and like pump this thing out. So it's like, you know, I've learned to try to paint myself into corners and
Yeah.
force myself to kind of come out swinging. And so it's like I need to create the impetus for the
Right.
need to write Mass 3 or whatever the hell I'll call it. And it's like I do have some ideas of things that are sort of swirling around in my head as far as like what would make a good book. And in some ways, I kind of think a collection of all of the like the Dave Rasco concept of like all the things that I think are a waste of time and why they're a waste of time
yes.
might be
Yes.
the really a good book to actually write. Like I
Yeah.
really think that
Well,
that
there's
would
not.
be.
I mean, it's one of a kind. I don't know of many like don't do this fitness books. Not that I can think of off the top of my head.
But it's
But
kind of
an
fitting
explanation
with
too.
a lot of the books that are like, this whole notion of like, don't make to-do lists, make don't-do lists.
Yeah,
And
not
you'll
to do
probably
this.
be way more productive because it's probably the things that you're doing that are ineffective, kind of like what we were just talking about using facial muscles to do exercises that don't require facial muscles. What are you doing that's actually like detracting from your ability to get the job done at the highest level?
Right.
So it's maybe I'll just call it like pruning the tree, but with Pat Davidson.
Yeah. I mean, a
You
lot of.
know,
I think it's like I don't
it'll
really
be a
get
picture of me with a bonsai tree on the front with those little scissors.
That's perfect. Well, I mean, you're getting more and more jacked every day. It's kind of a. It's like Jesus, what's happening with this guy? He's 37 and strongest human alive. So,
It helps doing Mass 2 with all the other savages that are doing it,
yeah.
and just seeing guys that like I got Michael Lexner, who I don't know if you've met yet,
No.
but great guy. He was at the last jungle retreat down in Costa Rica, but he's like on my heels. You know what I mean? And I gotta keep the distance between me and that guy. it's not so much that I'm motivated to catch people that are ahead of me.
Right.
It's that I'm motivated to prevent this son of a bitch from catching me.
It
So
is like a
I'll,
different realm just to see all like, I saw your post of Steve Tripp the other day, and sorry, that guy's got great content. Like, it's really, really
yeah,
helpful, good videos, and so it's good to see kind of the educated meathead market exploding.
I
But
had to send that 10 reasons you're not growing video to a client, and I am like probably going to lose this client, but this guy has been driving me crazy because he overthinks everything.
right,
He doesn't eat enough food. He's always complaining that it's the program design that's not working, and it's never his fault. Like, his lack of success is never his fault. And I was just, and he sent this like enormous email with like point after point after point of problems that he sees with the way things are going. And my reply was just the link to Steve Tripp's video of the 10 reasons that you're not growing,
yeah,
which is the most blunt and brutal thing in the world. And I'm
yeah,
like, you know what? If I lose you,
it
whatever.
is what it is.
Yeah, because this is the truth of what your problem is, spoken from a man who gives zero fucks.
Yeah, yeah. So, and one thing, like, to the kind of sacred cows point is, like, I think I'm a very logical person. Like, I did the 16 personalities time, and it's like max red all the way logical, like zero
Hmm.
emotion. And so I'm just like, okay, boom, boom, boom. This is how the things go. Which
Yep.
is, thank God I'm with this girl who's like very, feeling and good and present. And I'm like, oh, thank you. And when I read a lot of the sacred cow posts, or just like the exercises maybe that aren't as beneficial, or techniques that aren't as beneficial in training, that you've learned through experience, I'm just like, oh, okay, cool. Like, yeah, whenever I was doing a ton of band retraction in a 3-to-1 ratio with my pressing, I always had shoulder pain. So I kind of have
Hmm.
the outcome-based decision making of like, yes, that makes sense to me as an N of 1. Like, I never got that right. And so, and even like reading that post of like, okay, yeah, maybe it's not a great choice, right? Here are the reasons for it, and said in a very Pat Davidson, like, hey, I don't care. Here's the deal style, which is good. Like, it's all good. Doesn't hurt my feelings, at least. And then when you see the discussion on it, that's also where a lot of value is, because people like Miguel Aragoncillo, are posting like, okay, well, actually, I do a half kneeling, band diagonal PNF, and here are some of the things I'm thinking about, and it's like,
Hmm.
okay, well, then you've got sort of a good alternative. So I really think despite somewhat of like Facebook fitness professional land, it really is so helpful, and I definitely encourage you. I know you will, but I really think it's a great thing that helps a lot of people, and in turn helps a lot of people's clients. Stay out of pain and stay healthy and stay happy. So
Yeah,
this
I think you hit the nail on the head with the emotional versus the cognitive element of it too, because people pay a lot of money in fitness to go to these seminars and certifications and to hear experts talk, and they also have to put a lot of effort into learning what these experts are saying. And then someone comes along like me that says like, by the way, I think that's stupid, and here's why. And it's like they are going to have a very emotional response to that
yeah,
because they've paid for school, they've paid for certifications, they've exerted themselves to try to figure these things out.
right.
And now all of a sudden, maybe all that stuff is actually a complete waste. And that's going to really be inflammatory.
Yeah.
Um,
There's a good
so
there's a great quote, Seth Godin. It's the reason it's difficult to learn something new is that it will change you into someone who disagrees with the person you used to be.
mm,
So,
I don't really have any problem with breaking up with my former self.
right,
Like I can let that guy go a lot of the time,
right,
or at least like in the areas that I'm cognizant of. And it's like if anybody's paid a lot of money for school and continuing ed, like I'm at the top of that food chain, and I've worked so hard to learn the systems of people that I respect to such a high degree. But then if I hear something that makes more sense than the information that I worked for and learned from these respected people, hey man, I'm onto this new thing.
Right.
Nothing personal. It's just like, I'm going to try this out. I'm going to see what it's got. And, oh, it's working better.
Yeah.
So here's what I now think about this.
Yeah.
But,
It's
some
always like that
people,
results driven. Like, does it work? Is it working?
yeah,
Cool. I'll use it.
right. Yeah. Like, and does this spare me like 20 minutes of warm up time that I used to waste?
Right.
Awesome. Now I can get 20 more minutes of doing fitness or 20 minutes of doing nothing so that I can actually recover.
Yeah. Yeah, I love it. So we've got a badass seminar coming up December 16th and 17th, I think it is, in Austin, Texas. It's called Rethinking the Big Patterns. I think we have like 9 or 10 spots. Still maybe 8 or 9. I'll have to check. But at any rate, it's going to be epic. And then I think we're also going to video it for people that can't come in town. It's going to be really cool. So if you could maybe just give us a quick, kind of some thoughts on what might go down if you'd like.
Yeah. So, I always, in my brain, I kind of work with the same sort of like linear, how am I going to get the job done sort of model. And it's kind of like the topic is the big patterns of training. And it's like, first we have to define what those patterns are. And it's kind of like, so we have like resistance training patterns, and those would be your hinge, your knee dominant, your pushing, your pulling, and then I suppose your core. Okay. And, from let's just start from the beginning. Hinging is all of your deadlifting movements. So it'll cover 2-foot deadlifting as well as more biased towards single leg types of deadlifting. Mm. Then you've got knee dominant, which is squatting, as well as like anything from like a split stance or a lateral asymmetrical sort of stance. Then you have pushing and pulling. So vertical pushing, vertical pulling, horizontal pushing, horizontal pulling. Basically the derivatives that are with like sort of like bilateralism of both hands moving in the same direction at the same time, or having opposition of one hand ascending as the other one's descending. And then it's I guess core. And I feel like the classical sorts of definitions of core training has become flexion extension or anti-extension, anti-flexion drills, and then rotation or anti-rotation. And I'm just going to kind of call all of those things into question. And I just look at it as like core involves rib cage dominant exercises and pelvis dominant exercises. And they live in sagittal plane and then frontal and transverse plane. And like, what drills do I use for rib cage sagittal plane? Mm. What drills do I use for pelvis sagittal plane? What drills do I use for pelvis frontal plane, all of those specific things. And then
and anyone anyone that's ever seen in Costa Rica, when that was the first time I had actually seen you like coach someone through this stuff, and I always just thought you just talked about it, and then watching you actually work with a client with Ben House's dad was like, holy shit. And so just in that, I have the recording, just in that hour, like I rewatch that often to see like how you interact, what your coaching and cueing is, what you're looking for, how you're moving them in and out of the positions and the different movements, and really doing what we talked about is like getting that super good bang for your buck out of those different movements. And so just from a biomechanics perspective, I was just like, holy cow, like that is very usable. And that's, we kind of talk a lot about a lot of the esoteric stuff, which is fun, but like when I think this seminar will be a lot more of like, actually watching how Pat Davidson works with a client at, an elite level. It's pretty excited.
Yeah. And it's always funny to me because, it's like most people want to see the applied, and I've never liked being the applied guy,
right?
Because it's like,
I know,
it's sort of like that's just the outcome of knowing all the other pieces,
right?
And if you take time to actually learn the abstract, The applied is just simply knowing that stuff and just seeing what's in front of you and doing it. But you also, I think, do need to model off of seeing someone actually doing it at the same time. And it's like, yeah, I think that people are often surprised at how I go about the applied. They
Yeah.
see it and they're like, oh, wow, this guy can really coach.
Right.
And it's like, well, yeah, but that's what I do every damn day. And
Yeah.
it's super boring, and it's just like, wow, here we go again.
It's It's very boring to you, but for like newer coaches in the industry, when they see that level of mastery, it's like, oh, okay, got it. Like that is it's a cool, like almost like a little bit of something to strive for. So.
Mm-hmm. So that's sort of where I start. Is I think about all the resistance training things, and that's in large part the bread and butter. But then it's kind of like I think about other patterns, and I think about like the holistic flexion pattern and the holistic extension pattern, and just like, and then it's sort of like when I think about PRI in terms of like the holistic flexion pattern, they're dissociating the structures so that you're flexing some things while you're extending other things. And it's like I show these things in person, and I'm never afraid of giving away too much information in these settings where it's free, because people never really get it. It's like they have to hear it and see it a million times, and then it's like they get it afterwards. But, for instance, like I like to use the example of the all four bellies lift, or even like a quadruped position. So I'm always, I put people on all fours, and I ask them to round out as much as they possibly can. So I want them to push the ground, and I want them to feel their thorax move towards the ceiling, and I want them to tuck their tailbone under and experience a posterior pelvic tilt. And at the same time, to start off the exercise, I'll cue them to try to look at their belly button with their eyes, which will cause their neck to flex, and their eyeballs will essentially, like the orbit of the eye will rotate in the globe into flexion. So it's the whole system is flexing at that point in time. But I'm not learning how to dissociate and keep some structures in flexion as I take others out of flexion and increase the demand. So I'm generally trying to train the rib cage and the pelvis to maintain flexion and let the head and neck be free to do whatever the hell they want, while those other structures don't have to break down when the head and neck do different things. So, what I'm always looking for is, can this person go into system flexion and avoid sitting their butt back towards their heels at the same time? And what that tells me, because as soon as the person sits their butt back towards their heels, they break the 90 degrees position of the femur, relative to the tibia. And as soon as you do that you're activating the psoas muscle. So it's like this person doesn't know how to use abs to create flexion in a pelvis and trunk. They know how to use a psoas muscle to mimic a position.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, like I'll put like a foam roller behind their butt as a piece of information to like, don't touch this thing. And they stay out of that greater than 90 degree angle of a femur. And I'm like, do you feel your abs now? And like all the people that said they had no abs are all of a sudden like, yeah, I got them. And it's like, well, yeah, because you don't have a psoas. You're, again, not using a parasite to take away from using what I want you to use. And then, okay, keep those abs, and now I'm going to direct your vision to a part of the floor that would cause you to be moving your neck into lordosis. And as soon as they take the neck and bring it into a dissociated position, now all of a sudden the drill comes to life, and they start shaking and they start going crazy through the thorax and the pelvis. Up? They're moving their neck from being flexed and crunched into their body to now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's and they'll I'll just use their eyes as the driver of that.
Yeah.
And it's like,
wow.
Did you stop breathing? Did you, or can you do all that stuff and continue to breathe? Can you continue to maintain that position? A lot of times people will take their neck out of that position and immediately sit back because they were previously using sternocleidomastoid bilaterally to stabilize and be their abs. And as soon as I took that away, Now they're going to resort to looking for psoas again. So
Gotcha.
it's like, can I get you to achieve flexion of a thorax, abdomen, lumbopelvic femoral complex without using muscles of occlusion, sternocleidomastoid, and psoas? And usually that drill by itself is enough to teach so many good frontal or sagittal plane elements
Right.
and the ability to dissociate a pelvis, a rib cage, and a neck from each other. It's profound, and it sort of sets the stage for how I like to teach deadlifting, how I like to teach bench pressing, how I like to teach rowing, all
Mm,
of those things. It's like, can you learn this here, and then can we apply that to these
right.
other drills? Because so many times I just see people row and like they flex their head. So many times I see people do a bicep curl and they flex their head. They use their neck for everything that they do rather than the ability to maintain lordosis through a neck while they're using a deltoid to be a deltoid.
Right.
And so it's like those things in terms of like, what does flexion really mean? And then of course there's the biggest pattern of them all, which is locomotion. And it's like, what is this thing? What are the phases of locomotion? What are the different elements of stance and swing? And is there sensory motor competency that exists at the different phases of gait? And the answer is yes. And how can I recreate those things? And that's really kind of where that MedBall article sort of fits in as
Yeah.
one element of that. But then I'll sort of show how things like a knee dominant exercise in like a split split squatting, how you can change a split squat into being like the greatest early stance exercise ever,
Oh,
you
I'm,
know, or like having
it's music to my ears right now.
yeah, man, like then it's kind of like, how can we turn this like lateral squat, lateral lunge position into actually being like mid stance oriented and like the ultimate frontal plane challenge and building exercise.
Right.
And then ultimately like late stance, kind of like abduction, like getting your foot out of the mud and hip hiking
Mm.
and transversing it and like going into the land of like Chad Beckman stuff.
Oh, that guy. I mean, but it's like, I mean, I can't speak. I don't really know the statistics on personal trainers in America, but I think the majority of people, like at least the way how they make their money, they just train normal folks. and
Hmm.
and normal folks just need this kind of stuff. It's like, yeah, maybe it's the whole integration and like getting that bang for your buck and have they don't even know that you're doing it.
Right.
And
Nope.
it's
No
just so
clue.
money.
Yep. And it's like, I have a pretty high success rate with coaching some of the most like walled off people with like the least amount of sensory motor competency you could ever imagine. And I've just found like if I can make it work for a lot of the most difficult people in New York City,
Yeah.
it's like when I coach anybody outside of that demographic, it's like the easiest thing in the world
Right.
because I've had to like literally figure out how to do this stuff with the worst case scenarios.
Yeah. It's like
Um,
Tim Ferriss says, the extreme informs the mean. So it's like you're
mm,
looking at those tails and saying, okay, well, how does it work here? How does it work here? And if we bring those in, then it's going to be major success rate right in the middle.
that's brilliant. That's a great quote.
So yeah, I'm super excited.
And
Pat,
if I could just quickly follow up on
yeah,
that
yeah,
because
yeah.
that's such a brilliant, quick statement. I've always felt like people don't take things to the extremes enough, and it's like that. God, going back to that stupid lateral band walk thing. But I just think I
Some
think
people need
like
to
it.
know too that the lateral band. You just Google or just type in Facebook Pat Davidson lateral band walk. It was like 300 comments on this.
Oh
It's
my
like it's
God, it
a
was
book, but it's good. You'll
crazy.
learn. You learn
So
about human
it's
nature.
one of the things that drives me crazy is like people that are like, free weight exercise is better than fixed plane machine based exercise because you learn how to use stabilizing muscles properly. And, it's sort of, so it's like if you follow this argument to the end point, you would say that the better you are at free weights like barbells and dumbbells, the better mover you would be. Okay, well, let's take a look at the people who are the best in the world at barbells and dumbbells. Do they move all that well? No, they
Right.
move like dog shit.
Right.
And I'm a great example of that. And everybody else that I know that's pushed those things to the farthest possible level, we all move like blocks and like we move like refrigerator penguins. You know what I mean? It's like everything's locked up, everything's tied together. You've learned to sync all your muscles together to do every task with every muscle, as opposed to like learning how to be like essentially graceful and broken up with the way that different things can do different behaviors at the same time. And it's kind of like, man, I gotta disagree with you on that front. Like, I really think that you're not taking things to the extreme ends and seeing what actually develops from utilizing that method. And I don't know why people either A, can't see that quickly, or B, refuse to listen to that kind of concept. Because it's sort of, it seems so obvious to me. And it's like, I think I'll jump to those things very quickly, and other people need to like be like coaxed and like slowly oriented to that and explained in great detail why that's the case. And I'm like, it's right in front of you to look at and see with painful, obvious, like certainty that this is the end result from that. And then like look at the things that are just tied to it. And again, it's like the people that are super, super strong, they're going to learn how to like clench with their neck and grip things as hard as they possibly can, and like screw their feet into the ground and spread the floor, and just all of these cues that we just are taking for granted and fly so far under the radar. And we make these claims like, if you do these things, you'll be a better mover. And it's like, well, the people that are the best in the world at doing those things are some of the worst movers on the planet. Like, I'm going to call that into question.
Right. I love it. Cool, man. Well, thank you for making so much time. I'm stoked to get this episode 1 out there, and we'll maybe rock one of these every couple months or so. I didn't even get to any of the listener or any of the Facebook post questions except for Tio's. So
what are some of the other ones?
We've got plenty.
Really? Okay.
One that I did like was kind of about like how you've kind of talked a little bit about it, but Kyle Dobbs is like the man asking about sort of the lifestyle piece. Right, and so outside of training, you're still at the end of the day, you're getting these clients' results and realizing there's more than just movement, and you're looking at sleep and stress and nutrition and community and timing of light and circadian disruption, and so how maybe Pat Davidson goes about that in with his clients.
I love it. This is a great question to end on too. This is perfect because. This is another one that I think I operate backwards from how everybody else operates on.
Good.
I don't think anybody's going to change anything until they have to.
Right.
Okay. And I'm going to if you're going to work with me, the workout you're going to do on Monday is going to be a ball buster. Okay. Like, we're going to get after it. There's going to be an element of load and metabolic disruption that is incredibly unpleasant. And if you did behaviors that are going to be problematic for that, you're going to get punished so much worse than you would if you did positive behaviors. Okay, so, and again, like, I've got some clients that are real interesting people that like, they like to party and they like to, like, they're not playing nice, so to speak. You know what I mean? And I've managed to get these people to drastically change their behaviors through this methodology.
Yeah.
It's not worth it to them to not sleep all of a sudden. Like, it's not worth it to them to like, drink a case of beer or whatever the hell, you know what I mean? Like all of a sudden things start changing because they have to change, or the consequences are going to be really terrible. And then they start asking questions for how they can actually make things better. And that's when I can start. Like, nobody is going to do it unless they want to do it. And nobody's going to want to do it, in my opinion, until there's a problem. So I'm going to introduce a problem very early on, as quick as I can. And then all of a sudden, like, and it works for me too, man. Like, I know that whatever's coming up on Monday for me is going to suck. So for me, when I don't get aerobic work in on the weekend, I get crushed on Mondays. And so I do my aerobic work so that Monday doesn't suck as bad.
What does your aerobic work look like on the weekends? Just curious.
So I usually keep it super simple, and like I moved into the building that I currently live in because it's attached to a gym that has a Jacob's ladder.
Main question for you guys.
Yeah.
Is there a Jacob's ladder in the building?
and so like, my wife and I looked at a bunch of places, and like I saw this place with this gym, and I was like, I'm going to force the issue. Like, this is where we're moving to. And so I go in there and I start off with like, I'm going to do 10 minutes on the Jacob's ladder. And it's just torturous. Like, it's such a grind. But I get that done, and I feel so good about it. And then I go to the treadmill, and I just put it on 15% incline and 2.5 miles an hour. And I go for 10 minutes. And then I try to do 5 minutes on the Jacob's ladder, and then I'll do 10 minutes on the treadmill. And then I'll do kind of like what I was talking about before with sort of like the adductor machine, the hamstring machine, and some like machine-based pushing and pulling. Mainly just to kind of get like some blood glucose.
That 20 rep pump work.
Yeah, like I know that my weekend dietary choices are usually a little bit worse. They are. Like I like to watch football. My wife and I both enjoy football, and like going to like the local pub or something like that. And I'm gonna eat wings, and I'm gonna do some stuff like that. And I don't mind that, because like my primary goals are just like, can I move more weight in the different protocols that I've set up for myself. So it's like I just know that if I use exercise to change my blood glucose profile, that I'll be able to do something positive with those kind of potentially crap carbs and like other things that I'm eating on the weekends.
So you're doing like an hour and change
of aerobic stuff?
Yeah.
It usually works out to about an hour.
Okay, gotcha. Are you monitoring your heart rate, trying to stay at 135, or are you just kind of like feeling it?
I don't have an ability to do it on the ladder, but I do on the treadmill. I can just put my hands on the thing, and I'll like usually I'll be somewhere in like the 135 area.
Yeah.
And then the lifting stuff is like literally like, let's just make some muscles work a little bit,
right?
At a level that's not going to stress them out, and that will improve their insulin sensitivity.
Yeah, cool. And you do that just once a week?
I try to do that on both days of the weekends, but like travel sometimes throws it off, and like
Saturday and Sunday to accumulate a little bit of kind of a aerobic, more of a oxidative capacity aerobic base type.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
Beautiful, cool, man. Awesome. Well, I think we'll call it right there, and we will, come back. It's like, the reason I did this is like, I watched all of that Miguel Aragoncillo video like 4 times and taking notes and like watching it. I'm like, there's no more video of Pat Davidson on YouTube. And so like, I'm just going to get as much of this guy out there as possible. So I really appreciate it, Pat. And always good to talk to you, bro.
Likewise, Dave. This was great, man.
Yeah, man. Cool, buddy. Talk to you soon.
Sounds good.
Peace.